20 years, the lake had been David Carter's refuge. His small home, perched at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, backed onto a pristine private lake that shimmered under the morning sun. Every weekend, David would launch his modest fishing boat straight from his backyard dock, gliding across the calm waters with nothing but the sound of oars dipping and fish breaking the surface. It was more than a hobby. It was his peace, his sanctuary. When David bought the property, the developer had promised every homeowner with lake access that they could freely use it. The HOA, formed years later, was supposed to manage the neighborhood landscaping and enforce basic guidelines like lawn maintenance and holiday decoration rules. David never imagined they would care about his boat, but as the HOA board became more powerful and his president more ambitious, everything began to change. The first sign of trouble was subtle. One morning, David noticed a set of fresh surveyor stakes hammered into the soft ground along the lake's edge. They were marked with bright orange paint, running in a straight line between his dock and the small shared marina on the far side. At first, he assumed it was some routine maintenance project. Maybe the HOA was planning to replace the crumbling seawall that bordered a few properties down the shore. But no notice came, no email, no letter explaining the work. A week later, David woke up to the sound of machinery. Trucks idled in his driveway, and workers in neon vests dragged long steel posts toward the water. When he walked down to the dock, his heart sank. They were building a fence. Not just any fence, but one that ran directly across the narrow channel behind his property, sealing off his private launch to the rest of the lake. The HOA president, a sharp-faced woman named Linda Graham, stood on the shoreline overseeing the work. She waved curtly when she saw him, but offered no explanation. By the time David reached her, the posts were already cemented into place. A chain-link barrier rose section by section, blocking his boat's path to open water. Linda finally spoke at the end of the day. In an official-looking letter shoved into his mailbox, she claimed the fence was necessary to protect the neighborhood's common property from unauthorized use and prevent non-residents from accessing the lake. David knew exactly what that meant. She was accusing him of letting outsiders use his dock, an absurd lie. The HOA wanted complete control of every inch of shoreline, even property they didn't technically own. David reviewed his deed, rereading the original agreement with the developer. The lake was a shared resource, but homeowners with direct access, like him, had the right to launch boats from their own docks. The HOA couldn't just take that away. But the board didn't seem to care about legal rights. They cared about power, and Linda, newly elected president, intended to prove she could exercise it. The fence transformed David's weekends overnight. Where he once pushed his boat into calm waters in minutes, now he stared at a steel wall, cutting him off. If he wanted to fish, he had to haul his boat on a trailer, drive it to the far side of the neighborhood, and launch from the overcrowded community ramp. Exactly what the HOA wanted. They wanted him under their thumb, paying their fees, following their rules, and asking for permission. At first, David tried diplomacy. He attended the next HOA meeting, calmly explaining his rights and presenting his deed. But Linda dismissed it with a smirk, claiming the fence protected everyone's safety. A few of her loyal board members nodded along, while neighbors avoided eye contact. No vote was held, no discussion allowed. The fence would stay. Weeks turned into months, and David's frustration deepened. The HOA issued fines every time he tried to move his boat around the fence by hand, citing damage to common property. They sent warning letters threatening legal action if he tampered with the barrier. It became clear they weren't just blocking him from the lake. They were sending a message. But David wasn't the kind of man to roll over. The more they pushed, the more determined he became. He started studying the HOA bylaws late at night, poring over legal cases involving neighborhood associations and property rights. He discovered loopholes, inconsistencies, and oversteps in their authority. Most importantly, he realized something critical. The HOA had a legally built part of the fence on his own property line. The injustice burned in him like dry kindling, waiting for a spark. If the HOA wanted a war, he'd give them one. But instead of fighting them head-on, he decided to get creative. He wouldn't just tear down their fence. He'd turn it into something they couldn't stop, something that would flip their greed against them. One evening, as David stared at the fence blocking his dock, a wild idea struck him. If the HOA wanted to control access to the lake so badly, maybe he could make them pay for it. Better yet, maybe he could make everyone pay for it and turn their petty power grab into a gold mine. By the time summer arrived, David had drawn up a plan. He would build his own gate across the section of the fence on his property, complete with a keypad and toll system. If the HOA claimed to own lake access, he'd charge for passage, and not just a few dollars. He'd turn it into a legitimate business. If neighbors wanted to reach open water, they'd swipe a card. And every time they did, money would flow straight into David's pocket. It was audacious. It was risky, but it was perfectly legal. And deep down, David knew it was the only way to beat Linda at her own game. As contractors began delivering materials to his backyard, curious neighbors whispered and speculated. No one knew exactly what David was building, not yet, but Linda watched nervously from across the lake, sensing that her victory over David might not be as complete as she thought. David smiled to himself, knowing that soon the HOA's precious fence would become his personal toll gate. And if his calculations were right, it would make him a fortune. David's plan unfolded with meticulous precision. For weeks, he worked quietly with a trusted local contractor, carefully avoiding any action that could be deemed illegal by the HOA. He kept his building permits in order, documented every expense, and confirmed with his attorney that installing a gate on his own property was entirely within his rights. If Linda tried to stop him, she would have no legal ground to stand on. By early July, the structure was nearly complete. The plain steel fence that once felt like a prison wall now held a gleaming, heavy-duty swing gate, reinforced with an automated keypad lock and electronic toll system. A custom sign, clean, professional, and deliberately provocative, read, "Lake Access, $25 per use. Card only." When neighbors first saw the gate, they assumed it was some kind of prank. Rumors spread quickly around the cul-de-sac. Why would anyone pay to pass through a fence that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place? But soon, confusion turned into fascination, and then frustration. The HOA had been quietly charging fees at the community boat ramp for months, justifying it as maintenance costs. They limited hours, added boat inspections, and created so much bureaucracy that residents dreaded using it. When they realized David's toll gate offered unrestricted, 24-hour lake access right from his backyard, people started lining up. At first, David kept the toll modest, just enough to test the system. $10 per passage seemed reasonable to boaters desperate to avoid the HOA ramp. Within a week, he had a steady stream of residents paying for convenience. Word traveled fast. Some people even began telling friends from outside the neighborhood that they could get on the lake easily through Carter's Gate. Linda Graham noticed almost immediately. The HOA president stormed down to David's property with 2 board members, demanding that he remove the gate at once. But David was ready. He handed her a copy of his property survey, highlighted to show where the HOA fence illegally crosses boundary. He explained that the gate merely allowed him to access his own dock, and if others use it, that was their personal arrangement with him, not HOA business. Linda's face turned red with rage, but there was nothing she could do on the spot. Any legal challenge would take months, maybe years, and in the meantime, David's gate kept swinging open. As summer heated up, demand exploded. David raised the toll to $25 per boat, then $50 on busy weekends. He installed cameras to track usage and upgraded the system to accept credit cards and mobile payments. By mid-August, he was making thousands of dollars a week. The HOA tried everything to stop him. They sent threatening letters claiming David was operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise. They called emergency board meetings to vote on fines, but every fine they issued was overturned by David's lawyer. Residents were fed up with the HOA's heavy hand, and many quietly cheered David on. Some even called him a hero for standing up to Linda's bullying. As the money rolled in, David expanded the operation. He built a proper wooden dock extension and installed lights for night access. He added a small vending machine near the gate for drinks and snacks, knowing boaters would appreciate it. What started as a petty act of defiance had turned into a legitimate side business. By September, David had earned more than $250,000. By the end of the year, he was closing in on $500,000. Neighbors who once avoided conflict with the HOA now openly defied them by supporting David's gate. They were tired of Linda's constant fines, her obsession with control, and her arrogance at board meetings. The more successful David became, the more reckless Linda grew. She hired private security to monitor the gate, hoping to intimidate people away from using it. But when the guards tried to block David's driveway, he called the sheriff, and the deputies forced him to leave. The HOA was humiliated. Soon, stories about the toll gate on the lake spread beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers picked it up, framing it as a classic battle between individual property rights and HOA overreach. Talk radio hosts mocked Linda for building a fence that had turned her neighborhood into a profitable waterway. David even got calls from reporters wanting interviews, though he politely declined. He preferred to keep building his empire quietly. By the start of the next boating season, David's toll gate had become legendary. Out-of-town boaters willingly paid the fee, knowing it was easier than dealing with public ramps miles away. David hired a part-time assistant to manage the flow and keep records. By his own calculation, if demand continued at this pace, he would hit $2 million in less than 3 years. Linda, meanwhile, was losing her grip on the HOA. Members demanded to know why their dues were being wasted on a pointless legal fight. They were clearly losing. Some board members resigned rather than continue Linda's crusade. Others quietly switched sides, meeting privately with David to discuss ways to oust her from power. But Linda wasn't about to give up. As David's bank account grew, so did her anger. She filed a lawsuit accusing him of trespassing, claiming his gate encouraged non-residents to invade private property. But David's lawyer dismantled every argument. The case dragged on with no resolution, bleeding the HOA of tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. David, always one step ahead, prepared for the next stage of his plan. If the HOA wanted to fight dirty, he was ready to expose everything, from their misused funds to Linda's personal vendettas. By midsummer, David wasn't just a homeowner with a toll gate. He was a local legend, a man who had turned petty HOA harassment into a multi-million-dollar business. And Linda knew it. Every car that passed through his gate felt like a personal insult to her authority. The battle lines were drawn. The HOA president wasn't done trying to crush David, and David wasn't done profiting from her mistake. The neighborhood could feel the tension building, like thunder rumbling over the lake before a storm. Something bigger was coming. Something that would determine not only David's future, but the entire HOA survival. David's toll gate thrived as HOA pressure collapsed. Linda's lawsuits failed, draining the HOA's funds and destroying her support. Neighbors rallied behind David, using his gate freely while the board ousted Linda. In 3 years, David earned over $2 million. Proving the fence meant control him became his victory. The HOA eventually dropped all claims, and David enjoyed his lake in peace, with a thriving business built on her arrogance.